children at the moment, so apologies for the irregularity of the broadcast. But as we know, with Dovecat, there does tend to be a degree of chronological irregularity in any case, which I hope will be resolved when I move to the States in July and my timeline and my wake times are synchronized with more of American life. So how is everybody today? This is your pro-democracy variety hour broadcast. I started broadcasting to alert people to the dangers of Trump and Trumpism, which I believe to be the modern iteration of fascism, mainly because it involves circumventing the logical processes of the brain in favor of an appeal to the more tribalistic, primitive tendencies that humanity has, often buried under a thin veneer of civilization, to find enemies and oppose enemies. And when you're prepared to lie and emotionally manipulate people and pander to pre-existing xenophobic fears of certain stigmatized demographic groups, and I'm thinking here of the migrants and people of Mexican background that Donald Trump denigrated to an extreme degree when he said all Mexicans are rapists. That was a clear red flag of fascism, that you're prepared to circumvent norms, you're prepared to squash civilized norms that push down our impulses to find unity and find excitement by hating other people. When you're prepared to weaponize base hatreds, then you're a fascist who won't rule with competence or any kind of protective impulses towards the people that you lead. You will rule an eye to further manipulation of a democracy, because pandering to hatred at that degree of extreme pandering is fundamentally what fascism is. It takes over a democracy like like some of those parasites that render other insects into zombies. So Trump, to a degree, zombified American democracy for a bit. It uses the fire hose of disinformation. Jared Kushner has admitted on tape to Bob Woodward that they lie on purpose because it gets more media attention for their original assertions, which are no longer appealing because they resonate in a way with people's understanding of what truth is. Instead, they resonate with people's emotional truth that doesn't correspond to reality, but corresponds to their emotional needs for safety and their willingness to trade civilizational norms of civility and politeness and social cohesion in favor of indulging in base hatreds of other demographic groups and enjoying the moral clarity that comes with that, the clarity of that hatred. We hate Mexican migrants. They are rapists. Donald Trump's prepared to say it like it is. Other people say we have to be civilized and not denigrate entire ethnic groups, while Donald Trump's prepared to swing the pendulum back in favor of clear speech, forthright speech. So it's forthright, but it's fascist because it's a perversion of truth to pander to how much hatred feels like the truth when you yearn for something clear, when you've been overwhelmed by modern society and the deluge of information that's available to you in a modern world. You prefer Fox News, which has primed you for a fascist like Donald Trump, telling you that, why is there a fruit fly? Maybe somebody's put an apple core in the bin. Kim says, this time is okay. How are you, dear Dav? Hello, Kim. I'm well. And I'm talking about fascism, as I often do. I got advised the other day not to talk about fascism from someone who said, they just feel like it's overdone. And that kind of highlighted what I feel like I'm battling against in the American discourse arena, which is not just passivity, but an unwillingness to challenge others, or an unwillingness to feed what they see as the worst impulses of the right, because they know if the left accuse the right of being of governing it in a fascist, emotionally manipulative style, that the right will immediately use the same rhetoric of I'm not a fascist, you're a fascist, what am I? And they will ramp it up even more. So people on the left can be reluctant to openly and forthrightly criticize the right, knowing that the right have a very pronounced outrage machine that functions broadly across the right side of politics. The left can do outrage, but it's younger people being young and idealistic and saying, hey, everybody, let's not be offensive with our language. And they will denounce people for their language choices. And the right will, in a typical bad faith move, act as if that sort of push from a coalition of young people and academics represents the left in its entirety and represents the majority of the left, which it doesn't. It's just a go-get-em spirit from idealistic young people who want to improve society and often tend to call people out rather than call people in. So they're familiar with denouncing people. It is an effective strategy when you can get a lot of people behind you. Young people do not have a powerful billionaire-funded media machine to sell their ideas, although to a degree they have some of Hollywood, because Hollywood is often fueled by youthful creativity matched with older people who make executive decisions about what type of youthful creativity will be the most lucrative. Someone called Mineral Man is here and says, hi, everyone. Hi, Mineral Man. Why are you called Mineral Man? That's interesting. I'll move on to my first point, which is about William Barr and his memo, which will be released to the public because Amy Berman Jackson made a ruling last week that Barr's memo, or the memo from the Department of Justice to defend what William Barr did in making some stylistic choices in terms of how he represented the Mueller report to the public. And when I say stylistic choices, let me be forthright here. Let me be clear, as Barack Obama would say. He lied. He misrepresented the contents of the Mueller report. He did so purposefully to weaken its impact and to completely invert the impact of the Mueller report. There should have been legal consequences for Donald Trump. He and his team obstructed justice for a reason. They committed process crimes in order to conceal their larger crimes of colluding with the Russian government. Not just that colluding itself is wrong, but colluding with the Russian government for the purpose of manipulating an election result and falsely installing Donald Trump into the Oval Office when he had not gainfully won an election. It's not a gainful or legitimate victory if your campaign team is violating campaign finance laws so extraordinarily that there is covert cooperation between your campaign team and Russian intelligence officers. And there is evidence of that collusion. Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. Rick Gates has admitted that he personally handed over information to a Russian operative called Konstantin Kilimnik in the specific place of the Havana bar located in Trump Tower in August of 2016. That's what he did. He did it at Paul Manafort's instruction. Paul Manafort participated in those activities as well. They repeatedly handed over information to Konstantin Kilimnik with regards to polling data from expensive Republican polling data, regards to the propensities of voters to agree with certain things or disagree with other things. Voters from the critical electoral college swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which that information most certainly contributed to Donald Trump's electoral college win, and I should say win in brackets because it's not a legitimate victory if the Russian government is surreptitiously working to advance your cause. And using data from Cambridge Analytica, which stole data from 80 million or more Americans, and that they knew who was in these areas. Steve Bannon knew who was attending church through geolocation data from Facebook as well. They knew how to target alienated young men who supported Bernie Sanders and convince them that Bernie Sanders had been robbed, so it was important to revenge themselves on the Democratic Party by not voting for Hillary Clinton and not protecting America from the outcome of having an illegitimate, self-serving criminal tyrant in the highest position of the land. They also targeted Black voters to encourage them to stay home. And people have released spreadsheets showing the way that Russians compile data in order to target African Americans on social media with disinformation intended to discourage them from voting, or to give them misinformation to say, oh, you can vote by text message now. They were targeted to induce them to not vote accurately or effectively in the election, particularly if they lived in Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania. Mineral Man says, in discussions like this, there is only one question. Do you want to be right or do you want to win? Nope, absolutely disagree with your position, Mineral Man. Thank you, but no thank you. There's lots of questions to answer, and whilst Republicans have certainly specialized in how to confect outrage about all manner of issues and how to press people's buttons for concerns about their security, telling them they're at the threat of being overrun by communists, telling them that their hard-earned incomes will be stolen from them by Democrats because they misrepresent taxation as theft instead of proportionate, well, what ideally should be proportionate contributions to infrastructure via the government, infrastructure and social safety nets and all manner of things, military, defense, etc. That's and should be broad. The tax base should be broad. There should be less opportunity for wealthy executives, wealthy corporations, wealthy people to evade tax and to vote for politicians who will deprive the IRS of the resources that they need to successfully audit, investigate, and prosecute tax evaders, and so deter tax evaders from engaging in that practice. So yes, that's my position. We can ask questions of how much public support is there for encouraging or compelling billionaires to contribute appropriately to a system that allows for good governance, good protective governance. The only threat America faces is not external terrorist threats. There's lots of domestic terrorist threats, and there's lots of threats, lots of deaths that can arise purely from government neglect. The COVID crisis is a powerful illustration of what happens when a lot of voters are anti the idea of governance, have been sold a bill of goods that small government is the best, because the small corrupt government of Donald Trump betrayed Americans and neglected Americans at the federal level, failed to activate the Defense Production Act to compel corporations to engage in contracts with the government to ramp up production of masks, of protective equipment in general, of ventilators, etc., of key ingredients for testing supplies, because testing would have been key to containing the virus in the United States at early stages of the pandemic. And America certainly does have very expensive and taxpayer-funded institutions such as the FBI, the CIA, etc., intelligence organizations, which were providing Donald Trump with really important information about the pandemic that would have, if he had chosen to pass that information on, would have guided state governors to make decisions that were more in the interests of the people they led at a state level. But Trump chose to adopt a position instead of preserving his ability to negotiate with China for a trade deal, It was more important to him to conceal the manufacturing recession that was unfolding in 2019 as a consequence of his misbegotten tariff wars that he initiated with China and other trading partners. He wanted to be able to get a Chinese signature on a trade deal and say, look, I'm Donald Trump, I'm the deal maker, vote for me again in 2020. Don't listen to the media say there's a manufacturing recession. There's been a, look at me, I've got this new deal with China. He did sign a deal with China on the 19th of January, but in those critical days in January where he could have alerted the world to the fact that there was a pandemic unfolding, that there were details that should be of concern to leaders and to constituents, not only in America, but all over the world. And we know now that he definitely knew it was an airborne disease because he recounted that to Bob Woodward, not to Cuomo in New York, where the high level of international traffic made that blue-themed state more vulnerable than other American states to the initial onslaught of COVID-19. Mark Gage is here. Hello, Mark. I do not know what I can do, August. There we go. Okay, so if I have some rogue moderator who's blocking my favorite contributors, I can unmute them myself, I found out, by right-clicking on their name. So Phil, I've discovered that more rapidly than I did with Christopher, who had the same problem. He was muted by somebody who I've appointed to be a moderator who is probably not worthy of that role. I don't know who the mole is.
Your fingerprint.
Yep, that's my fingerprint. It's not going to be the same as yours, darling, because everybody has an individual fingerprint.
It looks the same.
It looks the same, but what you need to do is get some ink and press your finger in the ink and onto the paper so you can study it, and you'll see there's lots of little circles. They look similar, but the shapes are going to be slightly different for you and me, and for each person. So Phil says he's not optimistic about tax equity and the erosion of your tax system in favor of the wealthy. Well, Phil, you do have a Democratic president in power, and the Democratic Congress that have a majority at the House of Representatives and a very slight majority in the Senate are going to work to equip the IRS with the millions of dollars in funding that they need to successfully prosecute and investigate and audit wealthy people, the uber wealthy of the United States. So don't be pessimistic about it, because remember that we have to rehabilitate the idea of government in order for people to have hope and not to be passive or disengaged, but to be an active counter to the forces of fascism and the pandering to the wealthy and the pandering to the corrupt and the pandering to the forces of murderous neglect. You've seen how many people can die around you, how many people can be lost, how many loved ones can die as a consequence of someone who decides to run with COVID's being overhyped by Democrats, and my oppositional position is that they're all wrong and that mask wearing is unnecessary. Look at the number of deaths that Trump has likely caused by his desire to downplay the virus. He's admitted to it. He said, I wanted to be a cheerleader so people didn't panic. And we as rational adults can unpack that and say it's not his job to downplay a pandemic. It's his job to ensure that steps are taken to mitigate the damage, to contain the virus early before it spreads exponentially and affects exponentially more people. Mineral Man says, what does the fact that Trump got in the first place say about almost 50% of the American population? Well, it says that the population has a problem with minority rule because a majority of American voters voted for Hillary Clinton. A significantly large proportion of the population was disengaged and sat out. They've been misinformed that government in itself is undesirable. They were targeted specifically with disinformation for decades about Hillary Clinton, but that disinformation was ramped up prior to 2016. So what it says about America is there are fault lines of racism and to a lesser degree sexism, and those two interacting factors were compounded by international or foreign adversarial powers that intervened in favor of Donald Trump, in favor of ratcheting up those concerns, not just people who are racist, but then to make everything more inflammatory, to try and hold rallies that would scare people in predominantly white towns where outdated racist attitudes, where you fear a Democrat ruler because you have the idea already in your head that Democrats will give Social Security payments to Black people. You've been filled with propaganda for decades from Ronald Reagan about welfare queens, misrepresentations of how the social safety net works in America. It doesn't disproportionately, well, white people certainly avail themselves of social safety nets just as much as Black people in a proportional sense, but it's hidden more. It's not discussed because certainly Democrats don't counter Republican racist disinformation about Black people being the main recipients or the only recipients of welfare by saying, no, look at all the white recipients of welfare. They don't bother to do that, which is fair enough, but it does mean that there's a hidden level of poverty in the US that's under-discussed, which is white poverty. Democrats aren't going to argue for it because it doesn't seem to be a justice issue. It's more an information issue. But at the same time, if you dig deeper, it is a justice issue because it feeds into a false narrative of white people not needing government aid, and government aid being something that's just given to Black Americans, so that if you are racist, you vote for politicians who say we will get rid of financial support. And then you don't realize how many white people you're hurting alongside of the Black Americans you're also hurting. Are you hungry, baby? Okay, well, I better say goodbye to these folks.
No, my tummy hurt too.
Do you think you got a stomachache from the cookies and the gummy bears? Yeah, I think maybe you do. How about you just have a sandwich this time? Maybe you had too much for morning tea. Do you think you need a drink of water? Do you want to get your skin? Okay, your brother can help you get a drink of water, or your daddy. Mark says some optimism needs to be incorporated in our pragmatism. Yes, if I preface the word optimism with the word energizing, you need a degree of energizing optimism to mobilize people to be effective users of their own political power. Voting is not just about expressing your individuality, your individual voice. It's about recognizing that you share common interests with a lot of people, and that you aren't just here to argue about your opinions. You're here to make sure that your communities are served appropriately by your government. And Republican-led governments have been implicated in orchestrating mass death for two consecutive, well, not consecutive, but the most two recent Republican administrations. So George W. Bush unleashing mass death in Iraq through the misguided instigation of a war with Iraq, which was not necessary, which was based on the faulty premise of weapons of mass destruction, and was organized to meet an emotional need to satisfy people who felt afraid and unsatisfied that a proper amount of revenge had not been taken on American enemies. So they didn't mind that it was a very loose definition of American enemies when Iraq was attacked. Iraq was falsely conflated with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and the attacks on 9/11. So that was George W. Bush. And then, of course, you have helped kill 600,000 Americans and cause disabilities and long-term risk factors and long-term with associated with long-haul COVID, all of the people who now have an increased likelihood of developing Parkinson's disease, diabetes, or having heart attacks or strokes because they've been exposed to a virus that Donald Trump should have taken action to contain earlier in 2020. and should have promoted mask wearing as soon as it became evident to him that it was airborne. And he told Bob Woodward on February the 7th, this disease is airborne, which is tricky because when it's just touching things, and you can choose to not touch, but the air is more difficult. You can't avoid breathing the air. Phil says, your tweet yesterday about the inequality and gutting of the IRS was spot on. Thank you, Phil. I'm trying to pay attention, and lately I've been talking on Clubhouse to some people who know a lot more than me, which is to a degree humbling, but also energizing, because I feel like those people want to recover civility, but you can't easily recover civility without understanding what degraded civility in the first place in the United States. What has degraded civility is a conservative media machine that's untethered from reality. I'm sure Newt Gingrich helped amplify and exacerbate this process of demonizing your opponents to make them become enemies, to activate people's emotional brain circuitry when they think of their political opponents instead of their logical circuitry. So instead of Americans voting based on their analysis of what would be good for their country, they voted based on an emotional response of designated enemies. And those enemies were the Democratic politicians were misrepresented to Republican viewers of Fox, or Republican-leaning independents, or even relatively low-educated voters who might have been Democratic, but once they watched Fox News for a while, became prepped to vote for Republicans because they were brought into contact with the extremes of academia, and academic impulses with regards to cultural change. And cultural change can feel like an attack to people. When you say your ideas are racist, and when you say your Halloween costumes are cultural appropriation, if you've attended college and you've been gently led down that path of concluding, you've been able to then incorporate those changes into your identity. You see those changes as virtuous. You want to move away from cultural appropriation, and you want to move away from racist assumptions in your own mind. You embrace that process. But if you just abruptly encounter those ideas through Fox News, which represent them to you as an attack on modernity or an attack on civilization, then that can amplify any predisposition you have towards grievance culture. It gives you a grievance because you feel under personal attack from academics and from young activists who say, if you wear a cowboy costume, you are being malevolent. Now, there's malevolent, actively hostile racism, and then there's a lot of people who wouldn't consider themselves to be malevolent, who would consider themselves to be benign and patriotic. And the abruptness of those accusations triggers a high degree of defensiveness that rises into the level of longing for attack. So if you visit conservative pages, you'll see people there who yearn for Democrats to be arrested, who yearn for executions. And that is the culmination of a process of indoctrinating Fox audience members and indoctrinating OAN audience members and indoctrinating Rush Hannity audience members, indoctrinating them, emotionally manipulating them into a position where they feel attacked and they want to respond accordingly. And it feels proportionate to them. It felt proportionate to them to accuse Barack Obama of being a Muslim who sought to erode American security, because they were told that on a regular basis. And if you expose people to fear-based messaging for a regular interval, they will believe a lot of things that might be antithetical to their previous beliefs. You can program someone pretty easily by telling them scary things on a repetitive basis for even a fairly short interval of time, 2 weeks, a few months. It becomes more calcified and more rusted on if you continue that process for years. And Fox News has certainly been engaging in that process for years. The founder of Fox News, I think Roger Ailes, had established Fox News after Nixon was forced out of office because he resigned knowing that Republicans told him they would vote for his impeachment. So and his conviction in the Senate. So he resigned. Fox News was founded in order to prevent that type of occurrence from reoccurring, to prevent a Republican president being forced to leave office from accurate media reports giving rise to a public denunciation of that Republican president. So the public turned on Richard Nixon. Republican politicians in office felt they had to act in an ethical rather than a tribalistic, partisan way and just keep their president in power, even though he was corrupt and acting against the interests of the American people because of his corruption. Americans understood then you have to get rid of corruption because corrupt people will engage in misconduct that will endanger lives. Trump's misconduct endangered the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans, and hundreds of thousands of Americans died as a direct consequence of that neglectful malfeasance. Mineral Man said Biden's appointment went down very well here in South Africa. Good. Biden has a long history of advocating for the end of apartheid in South Africa. So his was a vocal voice decades ago. He's had a long history of being an advocate for racial justice, for equality. He also helped bring about the Violence Against Women Act to help safeguard women from acts of domestic violence where any disparities in physical strength have been entrenched in some people's minds, that they feel entitled to women and they feel entitled to preserve their quality of life by ensuring that their partners don't leave alive. So yes. RS has a thought which says intellectual laziness became more acceptable as our economy proliferated. Maybe you mean prospered. Because proliferated means spread, like gun proliferation in the US. Critical thinking became less needed to make a good living. Yep, okay, I think that's overly reductive, so I don't agree. And I hope you accept my right to disagree with your assertion. Other people might not be able to see this comment because they're not from YouTube, but thanks for sharing your opinion still. I'm grateful for that. Mark says the president is not supposed to have access to the information he had. I wonder what information you're talking about. With regards to coronavirus, Trump absolutely was supposed to have information, to high quality information. He was supposed to have access to high quality information because he's the president and he has briefings. He has intelligence briefings. And so they told him that it was a concern, that it appeared that China were building hospitals, that the pandemic was very contagious, and that the Chinese government were having to step up significantly to respond to this virus and to act to contain it and to localize it to the Hunan province. Yes. Okay, back to Barr, and I'll just quickly have a look at this. The Department of Justice has responded, saying they're not only appealing Section 2 of the Barr memo, but they're not appealing Section 1 of the memo. The court's memo may be released in its entirety. So the court's memorandum opinion, which discusses those previously redacted portions of the document, may be unsealed in its entirety. That's really exciting because that means we get to hear more from Amy Berman Jackson, federal judge Amy Berman Jackson. She wrote a scathing court memo about the actions of various prosecutors, various lawyers in the Department of Justice, because she could see from their email chains, from the chronological order of emails, that when they claimed that they had advised Barr of something. Then he'd issued a memo saying, yeah, Trump's innocent. The email chronology actually showed that Barr wrote his opinion first, and some of those advisement emails and advisement memos came afterwards. So they were memos written to justify Barr's behavior, and they weren't, and they lied about it in order to redact them and pretend that this particular provision of the Privacy Act or the Secrecy Act or whatever it is applied, because you're allowed to hide memos if they were written to advise someone. Like, yes, they have to come up with their decision and they can make that public, but you don't get to have a Freedom of Information Act applicable to advice, things that are written to advise the Attorney General. So Amy Berman Jackson says, hey, some of these emails show that some of these memos are written after Barr had stated his position, and so you've lied about that, and that's a deceit, a critical deceit for the American public. So they should get to see those things that were written after the fact to justify Barr's behavior. Stark is a great word. Yes, the COVID pandemic is a stark reminder that we are all interconnected, and that hyper-individualism is an approach that has a lot of flaws to it. And one of those flaws is that you advocate for small government and then you get small government. And when that is married with small, incompetent, corrupt government, you have really wretched outcomes for a large segment of the population. And there's lots of people in the US who are grieving their lost loved ones now. And whether or not they understand to what significant degree Trump and the Trump administration and Republican governors who followed Trump's lead are culpable for those deaths, are culpable of misrepresenting the research about masks, and that masks do help safeguard people, that Trump could have gone all out and marketed masks to the American people and spread knowledge that he had, that it was airborne, that COVID, unlike many people's first assumptions, was not spread by touch. It's predominantly spread through inhaling or coming in contact with airborne particles of the virus, and getting an infective dose through your nose, mouth, or even permeable membranes such as your ocular membrane. All right, well, I think my children have had their lunch break and I better go
Hello.
sort them out. What did you get, honey? What did you get?
Groceries.
Groceries, okay. All right, everybody, yes, I need to go too. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Take care and enjoy. If you see news stories about the Barr memo and Amy Berman Jackson's memo, check it out, because it is critical to democracy that Barr's misconduct be exposed, because he protected Trump from exposure as having committed crimes of obstruction of justice, which were committed in order to hide from the public the greater picture of his involvement in colluding with Russians in order to illegitimately win the 2016 election. Cheers, Phil. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Phil.